Behavior is anything that a person does, and it's not necessarily good or bad. It might just be that behavior is not necessarily appropriate to the context in which it's occurring. So we need to look at a behavior within a context in order to determine whether that behavior is a desired behavior or an undesired behavior. It's really important not to just qualify a behavior as good or bad. Let's take a look at an example. Jumping is a really great example of this. Jumping on the couch or jumping on the bed might not be a desirable behavior because it might be that they break the springs, or maybe the child will fall off and get hurt. So it's just not a very desirable behavior. But if you put it in a different context, jumping on a trampoline might be a desired behavior. So in applied behavior analysis, we look at the context in which the behavior is occurring to determine whether or not it's appropriate for that context. So jumping on a trampoline is a very contextually appropriate behavior. It's good exercise, it burns a lot of energy, and it's very beneficial. But jumping on a couch or a bed is an undesirable behavior because it's not appropriate to the context. You should be sitting on a couch or maybe laying down in a bed. And so those are the types of things that help us to understand a behavior and whether or not it's appropriate to that context. Understanding a behavior in a context helps us understand why the behavior is occurring. So we look at why that behavior continues based on the context in which it's occurring. In applied behavior analysis, we call it the function of behavior. Just about everything occurs because an individual gets something good or avoids something bad. Whether it's a desirable behavior or an undesirable behavior is really unimportant. All of those behaviors occur because the individual gets something out of it. So we want to think about that, and when we're looking at behavior that we consider to be desirable, because we want to make sure that desirable behaviors are working for that individual. And we also look at the context for those undesirable behaviors, because if it's working for that individual, then we need to change something about that context so it doesn't become effective for that person. So problem behavior is more prevalent among children with autism and developmental disabilities, due in part to their communication challenges. Challenging behavior often occurs because the individual doesn't have a more effective means to get something good or avoid something bad. So if I'm able to say, hey, I don't want to do that right now, and that's effective for me, then I don't need to engage in a lot of challenging behavior to get away from that task or activity. And the same is true if you have something that I want and I can say, I would like a turn with that toy, then I don't need to engage in challenging behavior in order to get access to that toy. I'm able to use my words and I can communicate with you. If that is effective, then I don't need to rely on some challenging behavior. So you can see how communication really plays an important piece in behavior. So in applied behavior analysis, the context of the behavior we call the ABCs of behaviors. We break it down, that behavioral event, into different components. We look at the antecedent, which is whatever happens immediately before the behavior that we're interested in, and that's usually within 30 seconds. And then we look at the behavior itself, whatever behavior it is that we're interested in, and then we look at the consequence. And that's whatever happens immediately after the behavior, again, within 30 seconds. So we're not necessarily looking at arbitrary parenting type of consequences that might be applied. We're really looking at just that immediate context. So what's happening immediately after that behavior. And those are the pieces that have the most impact on whether a behavior continues or it doesn't. It's really important that we keep that all in mind when we're thinking about behavior. An antecedent, again, is anything that happens right before the behavior that we're interested in. And it's often referred to as the trigger. It's usually observable, but it's not always obvious. And that might be maybe a sound in the environment, could be an antecedent, but you and I might not be even aware of it, but the child might be very upset by that sound. It might be that it's something that somebody said or the way somebody moved, or maybe it was a subtle suggestion that it was time to leave an environment. Sometimes just simply standing up is a sign that, oh, maybe it's time to leave, and that can be an antecedent. So when we're looking at that behavioral context, the antecedent is often observable. It's often something that we can see, but it's not always obvious. So we have to sometimes take a really close look at what might be going on in that environment. So the A stands for antecedent, and the B stands for behavior. And again, that behavior is any behavior that we're interested in learning more about. So it could be a desirable behavior, or it might be an undesirable behavior. And what we do is we look at it and we define it objectively. So we avoid placing any subjective labels on it, and we avoid things like emotions. We wouldn't say that a child was mad. We might say that the child took an object and moved it in a forward trajectory across the room. We're going to take it and look at it as something that is clear and distinct and observable. So anyone who might be observing that behavior would know whether or not that behavior is occurring. And that's really important. It's very often that we try to assign emotions to different things that are going on, but it's impossible for me to know exactly what's going through another person's mind. So I can't say that he was mad. He might look mad, but there's no way for me to say that he is mad without him being able to tell me. So when we look at behavior, we look at it in a really objective way. And then the C stands for consequence, which is anything that occurs immediately following the behavior. Again, that's usually within 30 seconds. It's not necessarily that artificial parenting type of consequence, like timeout or some sort of physical consequence. It's often just something that occurs naturally within the environment. Again, it's usually observable, but it's not always obvious. So it might be that when a child takes a toy from another child, what immediately happens is that that child has possession of that toy for whatever amount of time it might be, even if it's a short period of time. That child might have gotten access to that toy. We might then go and intervene and have that child give the toy back to the child, and maybe even put the child into timeout or attribute some alternative consequences. But in the meantime, what's happened is the child has gotten access to the toy and has probably also been reprimanded by an adult, and so has received some form of adult attention. All of these pieces go into our decisions and understanding of the behavior. We want to make sure that we're looking at it very clearly, very objectively, as to what happened in that moment that has caused some sort of consequence for that behavior. Then we look at the functions of behavior. Like we had said earlier, all behavior occurs because the individual either gets something good or avoids something bad. We call those getting something good behaviors, access maintained behaviors. And it could be that they were able to access something in a socially mediated way, so through another person. In an example where a toddler is having a tantrum out at the candy aisle in the grocery store, and the parent just is at his wit's end and finally says, "Here, if you stop crying, I will give you a piece of candy." That is socially mediated access maintained behavior, because the child is getting candy, and requires the intervention of another person. So that makes it a socially mediated access maintained behavior. There are also ways to get direct access to things. So in the example we used earlier, where the child takes something from another child, that's direct access. I go and I take a toy from you, I immediately have that access. It doesn't require somebody else intervening. The same thing occurs if I go to the refrigerator to get water in a cup. That's direct access. I don't need other people to intervene to do that. That behavior is reinforced because I'm able to access that directly. The same is true for attention, although this is obviously socially mediated. In order to access attention, you need another person. Those are the two main types of things that people might access. So they might access a tangible, or they might access attention. They also might access a sensory experience. those stereotypies that a lot of children with autism engage in, that hand flapping or the jumping or even the vocal stereotypies, what that is an automatically reinforced behavior. So a child does it because it feels good or serves some other regulatory functions. It's serving some internal purpose, and that child continues to engage in that behavior. It's an access maintained behavior, but it's a direct access. They don't need any help from any of us. The other possible functions are the escape or avoidance function. And again, those can be either socially mediated or they can be direct escape or avoidance. Somebody might engage in challenging behavior to escape or avoid a difficult task or a particularly long or strenuous task. They might also seek to avoid any aversive sensory stimulation. Something like a loud noise or even pain might be considered an aversive stimulation. Might be that an individual engages in a challenging behavior and another person removes them from that environment, and that makes it socially mediated. Otherwise, if I hear a loud noise and I cover my ears to block that noise, that is a direct escape. I'm able to escape that sensory stimulation by just simply covering my ears. That is a direct escape from that sensory stimulation. Those are the main functions of behavior. What we do in applied behavior analysis is we take all of this information, the context of the behavior, and we determine why that behavior continues. You can start to see that challenging behavior isn't because the individual is bad, and it's not because the child has autism. It's because these behaviors work for them. I like to say that all of this stuff works for your significant other as well. Even if you're not necessarily looking at it in the context of a child with autism, it's applicable to every human being. We all engage in behaviors either to get something good or to avoid something bad. This type of objective approach really helps us not to take behavior personally, and it helps us take that problem-solving approach that's so important.